Hello, I'm Fenwick Huss, Dean of the Zicklin School of Business. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar. In this series, we're exploring the impact of the pandemic on business and society, and today our focus is on the effect of the pandemic on New York City finances. Joining me today from the Dean's office is Associate Dean Gwen Webb, who will moderate the question and answer period. Our panelists include Greg David, who's the Distinguished Lecturer and Director of the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism, and he's also has been an active journalist, for example, with Crain's New York Business. Also with us today is Ken Abbott, a Distinguished Lecturer in the Zicklin School of Business. Ken was previously America's Chief Risk Officer for Barclays. And moderating the conversation today is Larry Zicklin, former Chairman Neuberger Berman. Larry is an alum of the school and the school's benefactor. Larry is also a professor in our undergraduate honors program. Larry?
Thank you very much, Fenwick. Let me address this question to our panel just to begin with. When I was still at Neuberger Berman, our founding partner, Roy Neuberger, who worked until his mid-90s and was alive until he was 107, would occasionally stop by my office when things got really bad, and he would sit down and say to me, Larry, we are in the soup. So Greg, let me turn to you. Is New York City in the soup?
Yes, we are in the soup, and it's going to be a long climb out. You know, I got to New York in 1985. I have covered three very difficult economic downturns in the city, 87 to 93 after the stock market crash, 2001 to 2003 after the dot-com crash, and to some extent 9/11, the difficulties after the financial crisis in 2008. This is worse than all three of them, clearly. This harkens back to the 1970s. And let me give you one stat here. In the 1970s, New York City lost 620,000 jobs. As of last month, New York City had lost almost 700,000 jobs since the pandemic shut down the economy. So that just shows where we are.
There's no question that this is the worst economy since the 70s. But one of the differences I see is in the 70s, the economy shut down because of all kinds of budget trickery and spending more than they should have been spending and fooling around with the accounting. This is not the case right now. The case right now is this COVID epidemic. The fact that we've lost about 20,000 New Yorkers to it, that we've voluntarily shut down the schools, the colleges, all the rest. This seems to be a different kind of a problem than we had in the 70s.
Yes, you are right. The city entered this period in great shape. Our economy had never been stronger, 4.6 million jobs. The city's finances were solid. We actually have been spending a lot of money and increasing spending because it was there to do. But there is one parallel that might be the same. And it's what I wrote about in my book that nobody seems to remember. The economy in the 70s cratered not because of the fiscal crisis. It cratered because the city's manufacturing base eroded. We lost 400,000 manufacturing jobs in the 70s because New York was no longer competitive. Now, how does that affect today's economy? Well, I think in two ways. Tourism has become a major driver of our economy. Some people think it counts for 330,000 jobs. I don't know when the tourists are coming back, but we know they're not coming back tomorrow. Secondly, we have to consider whether the pandemic will result in long-term changes in how people work. 400 million square feet of office space in Manhattan, a major driver of the city's economy. Will that office space be filled again? That's a good question.
I was out yesterday with a partner in an accounting firm who runs, I think, 6,000 employees in New York, of which the great majority are in two buildings. And he was saying that to get his employees into the building between, let's say, 7:30 and 9:30, 4 to an elevator would take over an hour. There'd be an hour wait at each elevator. That can't be.
You're right, that can't be. And so that was, what is that going to require? I'm not sure. It requires a vaccine, requires the virus to go away. I don't know. There are differing views here. So Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase gave an analyst an interview in which he complained about the lack of productivity on Monday and Friday, especially from young people. They had to backtrack. They had to say, oh, it's not the young people's fault. They're not getting enough mentoring. But there's clearly many CEOs who think that working from home is not a good idea. But there are also many CEOs, especially in tech companies, who say, maybe this is going to be a good thing. I don't know where this is going to end up, but I know it is extraordinarily important for the future of the city.
One thing's for certain that we could probably agree on. We won't have as many people in the office as we used to. It may be a lot less, it may be a few, but it's not going to be the same number as used to work in the offices. I don't know any business that's planning to have the same number of offices and desks.
Well, that's not good news for the New York economy. Those office workers drive much of the economy. And they also, in many ways, you're going to talk here about the residential market. And I've had lots of people tell me this too. As a matter of fact, I got an email from a reader. By the way, the introduction was wrong. I work for the city now, not for Cranes. They ended my contract. And I had just written a story about that I thought actually the exodus out of New York was ebbing. And he said to me, I want to move to New London, Connecticut. Why are rents going up so much in New London, Connecticut? And I said, well, there are many people who tell me that the distances people will be willing to commute will be greater if they only have to come to the office twice a week. I mean, I don't know if he was planning to go from New London to the city, but as far as I could tell, that's a drive from New London to New Haven and like a 2-hour Metro North ride in. But if people are going to only need to come to New York twice a week, they're going to be willing to accept longer commutes. That will change the residential market too.
Well, we know, or I think I read somewhere, and help me, that the residential vacancy rate is now in excess of 5%, which we haven't seen in a very long time.
Maybe ever.
Maybe ever. And real estate friends of mine say that it's hard to sell an apartment, but it's impossible to rent one, or lease one.
That's true. I will say that the latest numbers show that the exodus is ebbing. The number of leases in Manhattan in September were the same as September a year ago. The number of house sales in the suburbs around New York are starting to decline from their pandemic peak. I think there has been an exodus, but I think the evidence is that it's slowing greatly. And people within the city are now willing to move, say, from one place in Manhattan to another, because there are such good deals out there. You can get 3 months free rent, and that's after they cut the rent by 5 or 10%. So I think the exodus is subsiding, and we'll have to see if that's a temporary or permanent thing. Also, it is clear that some people have come back to the city because the schools are open. I know at least one colleague of mine who was up in the Catskills and is back in the city because his public schools opened.
Well, but think of the impact on the city. I'm just thinking of Baruch College and NYU, where I also teach. Both schools are basically online. Think of what that does to all the local businesses, the restaurants, the bars, apartments. Some on the margin, you can work from home and not have to rent an apartment or rent a dorm. You do it.
I actually think it's even worse. At the Newmark J School where I work, at the end of the semester, there was an interesting poll. 75% of the students wanted to be back in person, and practically almost the same percentage of faculty wanted to teach remotely. But here's the conundrum. If the students don't come back to Baruch, it is, as you just pointed out, going to be bad for the economy. If it's bad for the economy, it's going to be very bad for Baruch's finances because state and city budget revenues are going to be insufficient. So it's going to be of great difficulty to CUNY. Long term, that's not good for the faculty members who don't want to come back to work. So I just find it as kind of ironic in a way, but I do know the New York City economy will not fully recover till Baruch and the Newmark J School are back to in-person learning.
Well, so you started to talk about budget. How big is the budget deficit? And I'm assuming, my recollection is, in June, we signed off on a balanced budget. Over the next couple of years, how big a hole do you think there is in the New York City budget?
Well, we know the answers to that at the moment. The first one is that the New York City budget for the fiscal year that ended last June 30th was balanced. And we know that the budget that was adopted is supposed to be balanced. And by supposed to be balanced, there are two major ifs. If number one is that the de Blasio administration has to win $1 billion in labor concessions from the unions. Actually, there are three. Issue number two is that there will not be significant cuts in state aid. State aid is about $3 billion. Most of that is for education. The Cuomo administration is withholding 20% of it on a monthly basis these days in expectation that they may have to cut. And the third if is that will the tax revenues be what we projected? Actually, just before I came on the webinar, I read the latest weekly newsletter from the city controller. If you want to keep track of these things, that's a great newsletter to sign up for. And Scott Stringer pointed out the tax revenues are even doing better, a little better than we thought. So we can balance this year's budget if those ifs work out in our favor. The long-term budget deficits, though, are in excess over the next several years. They're around $10 to $12 billion. $3 billion this year, $4 billion that year. So that will be a significant challenge.
It's hard to see how this budget's going to be met when you have 16% unemployment. You have retailers not paying their landlords rent. I'm assuming landlords will ask for reassessments of their property taxes. I understand this hasn't happened yet, but it's about to happen.
Well, it's a long-term issue, you know. So the property tax revenues in the most recent period are up 4%. And the reason they're up 4% is that we cushion, especially residences, against rising assessments. So there's this backlog of higher assessments that have to work their way in. Will the landlords start to not pay their property taxes? I think that's certainly a big risk, but as you said, hasn't happened yet. But the other little complication is that it's the value of the buildings that set the taxes. So if building values come down over time, that will happen. The city made very conservative tax revenue estimates. So far, they're doing okay.
Reminds me of the guy that jumped off the Empire State Building and on the 50th floor said, "So far, so good."
You know, and you're right. I don't want to be this optimist because the city does have incredibly significant challenges. I noticed on one of the questions that they circulated to us, someone said the city's payroll had ballooned under de Blasio. Should we do something about it? Well, you are absolutely right. The city's employment numbers are at a record level. The mayor declined to use what are known as pegs, which is a way to get agencies to be more productive for 5 of the first 6 years of his term in office. We need enormous efficiencies in city government. We need the payroll to be paired. And the sooner we get to work on it, the better. And this mayor is not getting to work on it.
Just for a number, the number I heard was since he took office, we're up 30% in payroll.
I think that's about right. The number I like to use is that during his tenure until this year, Bill de Blasio increased the budget at 3 times the rate of inflation.
Well, but the money was there then.
It was there.
67,000 tourists came to the city. They were spending money. A lot of foreign tourists who stay a long time and spend a lot of money. But that's not taking place right now.
It's not taking place. In addition to the retailing problem, we were having the structural retailing change accelerated by the pandemic and the shift to online advertising. It's not good. I'm going to have a story coming out in the city later this week on the Bronx. I went to the Bronx. The Bronx's unemployment rate last month was 21%. That's Great Depression levels. The need for food insecurity and the need to deal with food insecurity in the Bronx is enormous. I went to a Bronx Works pantry where they're handing out 275 boxes every Thursday because the community needs them. And the people at Bronx Works told me that they have a major eviction program. So many people are building up such large rent arrears that whenever the residential eviction moratorium is lifted, and we don't know when that will be, it is scheduled for the end of the year, that there will be an enormous eviction crisis. So those are good reasons to be worried and pessimistic.
And it probably doesn't speak well for tax assessments and the value of property.
No, it doesn't.
Assuming the numbers are right and that over the next 2 years, there's $6 billion hole in the budget and budget deficit $6 billion, where can $6 billion possibly come from?
Well, 2 things. One thing we haven't mentioned is that de Blasio and Governor Andrew Cuomo and people like them around the country are counting on some federal aid. That depends on the election. But as of yesterday, the market decided that not only would Joe Biden win, but the Democrats would take the Senate. And if that's true, there will be aid. I don't think the aid will be sufficient, and I don't think it will last that long, but it will help. But after that, the city and the state are going to have to concentrate on 2 things. They're going to have to concentrate on effective ways to pare the budget, and they're going to have to concentrate on spurring the economy. And for whatever reason that is completely escapes me, that is a subject that neither Andrew Cuomo or Bill de Blasio have shown any concern about.
But it's not only New York City that's in trouble, it's New York State that's in trouble.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
we have to look to the federal government because the state can't help us. They've got their own problems.
Well, if the federal aid, the state is fundamentally a transfer mechanism. You got to think of it as like an insurance company. It gets the money in and it sends it out to other people. And the vast majority of state spending is on healthcare and education. So if there's federal aid to the state, then that'll help shore up the money that goes out, especially to education. But you're right, and the reason for that is the state's #1 source of revenue is the income tax. And the income tax has been hurt by the layoffs, and it's a big problem. The city's #1 source of revenue is the property tax, and while long-term that might be a problem, for the near future, it looks okay.
There's talk of 22,000 jobs being cut. Can that really happen? Is there the courage to do that?
No, there is not the courage to do that. As a matter of fact, it is pretty clear that the mayor will do everything possible not to do that. He just reached a deal with the United Federation of Teachers, which guarantees them no layoffs and guarantees them a 3% raise about a year from now. I think he will pull out every stop not to do that. He will try to pressure Albany into letting him borrow. And of course, he's counting on federal aid, so he doesn't have to do that. And as you've been trying to insist in this conversation, that's exactly the wrong strategy. The city has to make a fundamental effort to pare the payroll, to pare the budget, and to be more efficient. And the efficiency thing is really important. You know, when I took my trip to the Bronx, I got off the Deegan and I'm going down Sedgwick Avenue. And I looked around and there was a lot of garbage around. And I said to myself, wow, this isn't the way the city used to be. And as people are getting upset about the quality of life, the third thing on their list is the city seems a lot dirtier. And it is, because there were cuts to the sanitation department and it translated into less garbage pickup. That's not a road to success for the city. We have to find a way to make things more efficient so the city doesn't get more violent, a feeling of unsafe, and dirtier.
Ken, you were in the city in the 70s, weren't you?
Yes.
You and I were both there. Greg wasn't. Could you talk about what the city looked like in the 70s and how it differs from the city now prior to what Greg's talking about in the Bronx?
The difference is enormous. When I came into the city in the late 70s and the early 80s, the subway was filthy. There was garbage all over the place. You did not go too far west of 7th Avenue on 42nd Street. The fact that there is a Disney store on West 42nd Street continues to amaze me every time I walk down, having walked around that neighborhood in the 70s. It's night and day. The subways are much, much cleaner. And the city just feels like a safer place than it was in the late 70s, right up through the mid 80s. I would say it was like that. I wonder whether these budget situations, as Greg suggests, are going to take us back in that direction. Now, people still flock to the city to live there just for the sake of being in the city, but I wonder whether that's going to start to be a factor. I also wonder whether this is all going to be a factor in the 2021 mayoral election, which is coming up, and whether we're going to see an insurgent candidate come up and propose radical solutions.
Well, I'm worried about a vicious circle in which we engage with austerity, we cut spending. And where do you cut spending? You cut spending in education, you cut spending in sanitation, you cut spending in police. That causes a deterioration in the city, which causes fewer tourists, which gives you less revenue. And here we go in this vicious spiral. Does that worry anybody?
I wonder if we're really going to see a huge decline in tourism. I think that these issues will definitely cause changes at the margin. But New York was a popular tourist destination in the 70s, as I recall, and in the early 80s. There's still a lot of things that people want to see, want to do, assuming that we're past COVID, that there's a vaccine, or that there's herd immunity built up. I'm not as bearish on the city ceasing to be a tourist destination as others, because it still had its allure, even in the bad old days.
Yeah, but in the bad old days, Ken, and stop me if I'm wrong, the bad old days, the theater still functioned, Lincoln Center still functioned, all the museums still functioned, and right now, A, they're not functioning, and B, when they start to function, there's a whole group of more elderly attendees that are not going to be there. It's going to take a lot. Greg said that it's going to take a lot to get him to a Ranger game, or me to a Ranger game. It's going to take a lot for me to go into a crowded theater and sitting cheek by jowl with somebody sitting next to me. I just don't want to do that.
You know,
I agree.
We should remember how recent the great tourism boom is. Yes, people came in the 70s. Well, when Michael Bloomberg took office, there were 28 million tourists, not 67 million tourists. So 28 might sound good, but we built an economy based on 65 million tourists. We built an economy with 120,000 hotel rooms. And 2/3 of all Broadway tickets are sold to tourists. 2/3. So this is, you were talking about chicken and eggs. Well, we have a chicken and egg situation here. Because I don't think, while some tourists are coming back, I don't think we're going to have this return to boom tourist times until Broadway is open, until people are willing to go and sit in theaters. It is an enormous draw for the city.
And even if you get a vaccine, and even if the vaccine is able to be distributed widely, would you say mid-2021 is a reasonable number? Who knows how effective that vaccine will be? And if it's like a flu vaccine, let's say 50% effective, that doesn't do it for me.
Well, I don't know, it might do it for me. I'm dying to get back in the classroom. I'm going to be first in, when they let me get the vaccine, I'm going to get it, and I'm going to hope that means I can teach in person.
How about all the technology? Is technology working against the city? I'm thinking of more than teaching technology. I'm thinking of even medical technology. We get lots of medical tourists in the city because we have such great quality of medical care at the various hospitals. Nowadays, we're seeing more and more medical care taking place on Zoom. Now, you can't get surgery on Zoom, I understand, but you can speak to your doctor, you can get your blood tested locally. A lot can be done technologically, and I don't think it speaks well for tourism of a medical kind. To say nothing of learning, which is obviously being done to a great extent now online.
Well, we'll just have to see. You know, as far as learning, you know, we've learned three things. We've learned K through 8 remote education is something just north of useless. We've learned that remote teaching of high school students is not good. And we've learned that remote teaching for college students is not good enough. So I think that there's going to be an enormous demand to get back to teaching the way it was. But, you know, you're right about this. You know, all these predictions after 9/11 were that New York City was done, that there would be no need to be close to people, that we would all work remote. And they couldn't have been more wrong. It turns out from that day until March, proximity mattered. That's why New York has become this great tech center. Proximity mattered. The question coming out of this is, does proximity matter? The difference between net today and 9/11 is the difference of what we are doing right now. There was no Zoom. We could not have had this session after 9/11. Now we can. What will that change? Will it change business travel, for example? Some people predict there'll be virtually no business travel in the future. Why would you spend this time to get on a plane to go to a 2-hour meeting? I don't know the answers to that, but I do know the proximity question is crucial for the city's future.
My sense on that is that this crisis is forcing us to sort of sort the wheat from the chaff in terms of what can be done remotely and what can't be done remotely. I'm still in close touch with a lot of my Wall Street friends, and I'm hearing from them directly that there are some things that, yes, you can have a meeting with people in London that maybe you would have flown over for, and you can get some things done. But I think there's a core set of activities, as you suggest, Greg, that where proximity clearly does matter. I think that for younger people, the ability to network, or in this case, the inability to network, is going to cost people quite a bit in terms of career progress. And I think people are going to realize that. We're not quite sure where it's going to take place, though. I think we're figuring out now, it's forcing us to figure out what can we do really effectively on a remote basis and what simply isn't effective. As you say, K-8, largely ineffective. College, not nearly as good as it could be. I tell people that on the best of days that I feel like we're about 85% of where we were in person, on the best of days. On other days, much less. And it varies. I find that teaching technical material, and this may be because I'm a bit of a dinosaur, that teach technical material, I need to look in their eyes and see whether they understand it. Because on more than one occasion, I said, okay, we're going to go back to the beginning of the lecture and start again because I don't think people really understood this. I think institutional material in the classroom can be effectively taught via Zoom or, for that matter, via Khan Academy.
I couldn't agree with you more. That's exactly the same number that I give. The best I can do is 85%. The best I can do, and there is no way for me to close the last 15%. And as a teacher, you cannot read the room. You do not know what they're doing, even if you make them turn their cameras on. You cannot be sure what they're getting. And that's why college education is not what it needs to be. So we will see. And I just want to buttress your Wall Street point. I have a friend who runs a trading desk for a global insurance company. He brought part of his team back as soon as he could. He's been back, I think, 3 or 4 months, because in the end, they could not run a trading desk well remotely.
Well,
What I think we're seeing, and anecdotally, I've heard this, I heard this starting before COVID. JP Morgan's been moving people to El Paso. Morgan Stanley's been putting people in Salt Lake. City's been putting people in South Dakota, not to mention the offshoring or right sourcing, as people say, in terms of Mumbai, where most of the big banks have operations, Prague, where Goldman Sachs has an operation, Budapest, where Morgan Stanley has an operation. And we're starting to figure out where things can be done effectively and where things can't be done effectively. And I feel like it's going to take 5 to 10 years before we see, from a business standpoint, what worked and what didn't work. And from an educational standpoint, it's going to take success measures in 20 years. We'll see how many CEOs, for example, or board members got online educations versus didn't get online education. It's going to take that long, I think, to really sort out the long-term impact of this.
Here's what I'm watching. Jamie Dimon, as what is regarded as what he's going to, his legacy for his successor, has planning to build this big new headquarters on Park Avenue and put 15,000 people in it so that he's got all his people in New York in one building. And these, of course, are all the high paid people. The people they're moving elsewhere are the middle desk people. If JP Morgan Chase continues with its plan for a new headquarters, that will be good news for New York City's future. If JP Morgan does not continue with that plan, that's bad news for the city's future. And so that's one thing I'm watching very closely.
Well, I'm not thinking of this as a binary question. It's not all or none or absolute. It's on the margin. I think more people will be taught online, but not everybody. I think we're going to get better at this. Remember, this is only the first year of a new technology, and the technology is going to get much better. The technology is in the ascendancy. The number of teachers who can teach this are probably in the ascendancy. I don't know if it'll be better or worse, but you can think of another industry in the world where 500 years ago, an instructor stood in front of 20 kids and taught them, and 500 years later, somebody's standing in front of 20 kids and teaching them. No other industry is that way.
But so that's fine. You can be right. So if I were a real estate investor, I would not, if you're right, I would not be investing in New York City real estate.
Well, and I agree with you. Where Jamie Dimon goes is important. It's going to be interesting to see if that building ever takes place. I'm a little dubious. I want to go to a possible solution. Is taxing New Yorkers to a greater extent than they're taxed now a potential solution?
Well, certainly there are many people who want to do that. The Democrats who control the legislature are determined to tax millionaires or people with $2 million a year more. The governor is adamantly opposed. He says it will cause people to leave. I would note that the marginal income tax rate for New York City residents is the second highest in the nation. Even with New Jersey's recent increase, it's still higher than New Jersey. I do believe that it could cause people to leave. You can use whatever, there are different ways to slice this number, but the top 1% of taxpayers in New York State, the top 1% of taxpayers in New York State pay 40% of all the state's income tax.
I think in New York City, it's 50%.
Yes, but the income tax is less important, so it's not quite as impactful.
I agree.
Now, that is not to say, I just want to say clearly, that is not to say I don't believe that you can tax the wealthy nationally. I think it's clear the federal government could raise taxes on the wealthy. And actually, if that bill were accompanied by the restoration of the state and local tax deduction, that would be good news for New York City. There are some fiscal people in the city, even the Citizens Budget Commission, who are willing to entertain some modest property tax increases over the next few years to help out the budget. They don't think that would be as worrisome.
Can the city engage in any more borrowing than it does now? They're talking about borrowing $5 billion. And I don't mean for capital projects. I mean for operating costs. Is that possible?
Well, it's only possible if Albany gives us approval. The city cannot do it on its own. It needs approval from Albany. So it is possible. You know, the state might actually borrow. The state has already borrowed money because it needed to borrow money because of the delay in the income tax payments. The federal government said you didn't have to pay your taxes till July. That meant all the money we expected in April didn't come till July. The state borrowed $4.5 billion. It's planning to pay it back, but it might not, might decide to do that. Is this good policy? No, it is never good policy to borrow to fund operating expenses. That's what happened in the 70s. And in particular, if the real fight at the moment is de Blasio wants to borrow money so he doesn't have to make judicious cuts in the budget. So he doesn't have to do anything about the number of employees. If we're going to get anywhere in this crisis, he has to cut the budget first, and then maybe there could be an argument for borrowing, but not without this very important efficiency-minded trimming of the city budget.
The number I've seen is that New York City households are already bearing about $81,000 of, in effect, city debt per household. If you divide the number of households by the city debt, it's about $81,000, which is the largest, the highest number in the country. So that's big. Let me ask one more question. Should we do what I think Dick Ravitch has proposed, Dick Ravitch having been one of the architects of the 70s solution to the problem? And he's suggested putting together a group to oversee the city's finances and do what they did in the 70s. Do you like that?
Well, Dick, I must say, I should admit here that I am the Ravitch Fiscal and Economics reporter at the city, and I run the Ravitch Fiscal reporting program at the J School. So Dick tells this great story about Ed Koch. The Financial Control Board, which is what you are outlining here,
Right.
Had just cut the budget. Koch had gone to the Financial Control Board to argue against cuts they wanted in the budget. And he gets off the public forum where he's telling the Financial Control Board, don't do it. And then he turns to the people near him and said, thank God for the Financial Control Board. So if we don't think that the leaders of the city can make the tough decisions, then that is a reasonable response.
My question, Larry, is who's there? Felix Rohatyn? Who steps into the brink?
Well, I can tell you, it could be Jamie Dimon.
This is the great problem. This is the great problem. The city leadership, the business leadership is no longer as connected in the city as we were in the 1970s. And that's a big problem.
Yeah, but remember, Felix Rohatyn wasn't Felix Rohatyn until after the budget crisis. He was a respected banker. but he wasn't the Felix Rohatyn we think about. They're out there. There are leaders out there. And I kind of agree with Greg. It's not quite the same as the 70s. But though there are good people out there, you've just got to call on them.
I would
Calls
just
on them, and how do they get engaged, though?
Is the
That's
politics of today allowing that?
I'm sorry?
The politics of today going to allow that?
Well, the answer is, if de Blasio doesn't want to make the hard choices and nobody else does, by default, this has to happen. Because
Is
you
this
want to
going to
make
be
hard choices.
Blasio's choice, though, after 2021? It's going to be somebody else there.
Well, I think that's true. My guess is de Blasio will want to push this to 2021 and let his successor have all these problems, if he can.
I think you're right.
He's already done that with the teacher's contract.
I mean, it's ridiculous to sign a teacher's contract for 3 years, 3% increase, no layoffs. It's an absurdity. Gwen, it looks like you want to get a question in.
Well, we've received quite a few questions before the webinar. We're receiving quite a few during the webinar. Let me just start, and some of them are very reflective of themes that you've already discussed. One of them is the following: does New York City have the political leadership to promote the city and make the right decisions to create an environment where people will want to continue to work in New York City?
Well, the first answer to that is that the people of New York have clearly lost confidence in the mayor. And the mayor doesn't seem very interested in the mayor has never been very interested in the running of the city. And now he's focused in on just a couple of things. Great story in the New York Times about the imposition of the restrictions and how the de Blasio-Cuomo feud made it all worse. So that makes us turn to the 2021 mayoral race. By the way, this is not that far away. The Democratic primary will be in June. I do not believe that an independent candidate can win anymore, a la Michael Bloomberg. I think Donald Trump has ended any chance for anyone to ever run as a Republican in New York City. So the battle will be fought in the primary. We now have attracted a whole series of new candidates. There are names being floated which would represent this sort of Bloombergian candidate: Sean Donovan, Ray McGuire from Citigroup. There might be others, but we are also having candidates who are going to run as very progressive, attack inequality, tax the wealthy, etc. It will be the most important mayoral election in a long, long time.
Ken or Larry, do you want to add to that? The next question is following very close on that.
No, I agree. I think the next mayor is going to have his or her hands full, and you hope that that person is a real leader and not a political hack.
I concur with that.
All righty, so here's the next question following on the mayoral issue. To what extent does the fate of the city depend on the result of the presidential election coming up in a few weeks?
Well, I don't know. I think that the appropriate question is the fate of the country depends on it. But I would say this. Here's the way I think it plays out politically. If Trump wins, the only mayoral candidate, the mayoral candidate will be the person, the most progressive person who promises to be the most anti-Trump person. For an independent candidate to argue for moderate policies in New York City, Trump will have to lose.
It's interesting. I don't know why he hates the city so much. He has a big building in the city down on Wall Street. He owns a piece of the building my offices happen to be in on 6th Avenue. I don't know what this hate is, but he's got it.
All right, taking a slightly different but related track, could you discuss the legal and financial restrictions that weigh on New York State and New York City going forward?
You know, I love this question because I teach it in my program, and it's called Dylan's Rule. Dillon's rule is a late 1800s federal court decision, actually, that came out of Illinois, which said cities have no power, zip, no power. All power resides in the state. Cities are creatures of the state. That's why New York City can't change a single one of its taxes except the property tax. And it can only change the rate. It can't change the rules for the property tax. That's why Andrew Cuomo is completely in charge of the coronavirus response. He has all the power and de Blasio has none. And that Time story I referenced a moment ago just explains that. So that's the issue. All power resides at the states. States can delegate powers to cities. In New York State, we have delegated very few.
So that, wait a minute, does that mean no matter who the mayor is, it's not a solution? Because whoever that mayor is doesn't have the power?
They have limited powers as the state has prescribed to them. But in the end, if the legislature and the governor want to, they can like abolish New York City tomorrow.
So what we need is a mayor who's really friendly with the governor.
Well, mayors and governors in New York have feuded for a long time, but never like this.
Your turn, Gwen.
All righty. Historically, America has come back stronger than before, following multiple crises. And you've mentioned them already, the 70s, the 80s, the 9/11. I believe that part of the reason to come back stronger was to force innovations in technology and to make necessary adjustment. Do you think this time is different from the past historical cases? If so, why? If not, why not?
Well, first of all, I'm getting really tired of the facile comments from the mayor and others. Oh, we've come back stronger every time, it'll be fine. That, by the way, leaves out the 70s when it took 2 decades to do so. I don't really want to endure 2 decades, and I don't think anyone else does. But the second thing is, I disagree with the historical analysis. New York finally thrived at the end of the in the 80s when Wall Street discovered bonds and Salomon Brothers became great and Wall Street became the most important industry in the city. That's why we thrived. When we began the 80s, Wall Street accounted for about 4% of the city's employment and about 8% of the city's pay. By the time you get to Liar's Poker, Michael Lewis's great book, Wall Street accounts for almost 20% of the pay in the city. And if you get to 2008, Wall Street accounts for 28% of all the pay in the city. So the reason New York City did so well for so long was because Wall Street did so well and made New York City rich.
Yeah, but there's a new world out there now, and that's the world of technology. I have a nephew who's a trader at a large firm. The chances of getting him back into the office are about 0. And the firm doesn't need him back. The technology is so good now that he can see exactly what's going on in that trading room, hear everything the way he would have heard it before. He doesn't have to be back, and he saves himself whatever it is, 3 hours a day in commuting. He also is more efficient because he doesn't have to commute an hour and a half on each end. So I think the technology is changing all that. And I couldn't agree more with Greg when he says these facile explanations of it's always been this way and we've always come back. That's the way to get yourself in trouble. You have to address your problems as they come due and not simply say, we always came back, therefore we always will come back. And I also remember the 70s, and I remember the 15 or 20 years of what it was like coming back from what happened in the mid-70s. So I don't accept that explanation at all. I think the world is always different. And while it's always dangerous to say this time it's different, very often it's different.
Ken, anything to add to that?
I'm inclined to agree with both. I think it's really hard to see the X factor is that's going to magically appear to make everything better. I mean, we've seen the city come back from crisis after crisis, but we're seeing this fundamental shift of resources outside of urban areas to suburban areas. We see it in Wall Street, which, as Greg correctly points out, has been a major engine of economic growth in New York. I think we're going to continue to see that. I don't think we found the equilibrium level yet. I think that this crisis is forcing that issue and forcing us to come to terms with it. I think there will be a balance in terms of the outflow of positions from New York. I don't think we found it yet, but my gut tells me there'll be a core of people that will still want to remain at corporate headquarters.
I think that's right. I completely agree. But on the margin is where all the money is made. Look at the restaurant business in New York. The restaurant business is to some large degree an immigrant business. Look at what this diminution of restaurants has done to the immigrant population. 90% of the population of New York, I forget where I read the statistic, has a lower net worth today than it had a year ago. 90%. It's an enormous number. The immigrants now are not flocking to New York to go and start some new restaurant. It's just not happening. And we're talking hundreds of thousands. So the world is not, as I said, binary. It's not all or none. It's on the margin. And on the margin is where all the money is made.
All right, I have the next question is for Greg. In addition to your work as professor at CUNY's School of Journalism, you're a regular contributor to the city, and Matt has given a notice of that in chat. It's a nonprofit news organization devoted to our city. Can you tell us about some of the stories that you're working on for the next few editions?
I can. So as I said, in the next few days, I'll publish a piece about the Bronx. We'll have new economic stats coming out on Thursday. And I think I'm going to be doing a piece about the state of the office market in conjunction with that piece. Very worrisome news about the amount of sublease space on the market. And after that, I'm going to really look at this issue of the commercial rent issue. We know so many stores have not been paying rent. There is a moratorium on the eviction of those stores. What's going to happen when it's over, and what can we do about it?
I'll be looking forward to reading them. And this is a question for Ken. Ken, in your career, you've had extensive experience in the financial markets, and now you're a full-time professor at the Zicklin School. As you look to the city's future, what role do you see for the financial sector, and what role do you see for the college itself?
I think that the college provides an excellent education for students at a very reasonable price. And that's what I love about Baruch. I love all the articles I see that come out and say, look, it's got all these great rankings because it provides opportunity for first generation college, first generation immigrants. Many of my students are both. I feel like Baruch's going to continue to provide that. And I feel like the education that students get here, it's not a liberal arts education. Not Zicklin. It's not designed to be. It's a business education. We talk to students about the skills you actually need to do these particular jobs. I think there's plenty of places in the educational system. If you want to be an English major, it's great. At Zicklin, we talk about business, we talk about finance, we talk about marketing. I think Baruch does that in outstanding fashion, and I'm still bullish on the ability of Baruch to provide these opportunities, particularly for this set of students. That's what I think about that.
And what about the financial sector? Will it continue to be a leading sector for the city?
I feel like even if it contracts a bit, I still feel like it's going to be a major contributor to the city's economy for the time being, for the foreseeable future. As a matter of fact, I think, as Larry suggests, at the margin, it may well be reduced, but I still think it's going to be a major component of the employment situation here in New York and a major contributor to the city's income in terms of the tax base.
All right, and our last question now is for Larry. Larry, would you look into a crystal ball and imagine how life in the city might be different in the future, well after the pandemic is behind us, no matter whether it's because we have a vaccine or we've just learn to live with it?
I don't think we can learn to live with it. I think this has to be solved. We're not going to live with it. I must admit, I'm not as optimistic of on the city as I used to be. Maybe it's my age and I'm not that optimistic in general, but I'm not that optimistic because I think the trends are working against the city. I think some of the things in finance, I think there'll be fewer people working in finance in the city. There'll be plenty, but fewer. I think universities will use technology. I think there'll be fewer faculty, fewer staff, because technology will take up that role. I think I'm worried that climate change is more than oceans and hurricanes and tornadoes. I'm worried that what happened here in this pandemic has something to do with climate change, and that we may see this again. And I think people will have, for the next 10 years, an aversion to working very closely with one another, that there'll be some kind of a fear, even with a vaccine, about working closely together. And so for those reasons, I don't think the city will come back so easily. I also think this crisis that we have, this fiscal crisis, is not going to go away so easily. I think New York has a real chance of having a severe fiscal crisis. I don't know if that means bankruptcy or not, but I don't see the leadership. I don't see the state leadership. I don't see the federal help. Unless something comes along, I suspect this thing could get a lot worse, because we're pushing this debt out. You know, we talk about 5 billion or 6 billion over the next 2 years and something like it in the 2 years following that. There's got to be a solution, and I don't see the political will. I'd like to see the political will, but I don't see it.
Ken or Larry, any last words on this topic?
I'm not quite as bared up about the city there. I feel like there will be some kind of comeback. It's hard for me to say exactly what, because I can't identify the X factor that's going to make everything all better. I think it's going to take time, though. I agree with Larry there that it's going to, the recovery period, it could be extended.
But the comeback, I talked to a lot of friends about this, the comeback is always based on the fact that we've always come back. And it's not a bad argument, but it's not a perfect argument.
I think we'll have to leave it there. It's been a really riveting, compelling discussion. Being optimistic, I'd like to mention that our next webinar is planned for November 10th on the topic of entrepreneurship, with insights into how entrepreneurs may help. Maybe they're going to be part of that X factor. For now, I hate to close the discussion, but I want to thank you, Greg David, Ken Abbott, Larry Zicklin, for a really, really fascinating discussion. Thank you all.